presentation of the South Carolina ETV Network.
Funding for this program was provided by the Smith Richardson Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the J.M. Foundation, this and other public television stations, the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, and the John M. Olin Foundation. Additional funding was provided by the LTV Corporation. LTV is a leading producer of steel, aerospace, defense, and energy products.
And many of you have heard me say so many times that the parallels between 1960 and 1988 are very close indeed. To recapture the spirit of energy and of confidence and of idealism that John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson inspired a generation ago, the kind of respect that John Kennedy earned when he forced the withdrawal of those Soviet missiles from Cuba and signed the world's first nuclear test ban treaty. Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson beat that incumbent Republican vice president in 1960, and Mike Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen are going to beat him in 1988.
Why is Governor Dukakis harking back to the early 1960s? That's when Democrats were still winning presidential elections. Since then, a lot has happened that Democrats would like to forget or change.
Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. You know, from 1932 to 1964, Democrats won 7 out of 9 presidential elections. And since that time, that's from 1968 until today, they didn't win 7 out of 9, they've lost 4 out of 5. Can Dukakis and the Democrats put it together? In the next hour, we'll look back at what happened to the Democrats in recent times and then see what they're doing about it in 1988. A second program, hosted by David Gergen, will examine the Republicans.
That you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
And will
Our story begins with President John Kennedy. Public opinion polls today show that Kennedy is by far the most popular recent president. Some historians, who judge mostly by legislative accomplishments, say he is overrated. But voters know that a good president should make Americans feel proud and vigorous, confident that the country is moving ahead in accord with deep-rooted American values.
What are those American values? A standard formula is a triad: our role in the world, our social values, our economic system. Americans believe we stand for something special in the world, that we have some responsibility to defend and extend liberty. Americans believe religion, family, and morality are the bedrock of American life. Americans believe our economic system is sound and yields a rising standard of living. Now, in the early 1960s, there was agreement between the two parties about this triangle of values. And with such consensus, the parties could then play hardball politics. Democrats championed the cause of using government to help the little guy, the middle-class common people. Those stingy Republicans, they said, hey, they were country club fat cats. Since there are more little guys than fat cats, Democrats often won elections.
Jack Kennedy came to embody many of these values. He was a hardliner on foreign policy.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
When aerial photos revealed Soviet missiles in Cuba, Kennedy hung tough.
All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
The Soviets backed down. Yet Kennedy knew that strength should yield peace. He negotiated the first major nuclear weapons agreement, the Test Ban Treaty. He sensed the power of idealism. He established the Peace Corps. The young volunteers became known as the Children of Kennedy. Liberals loved it. Yet liberals howled when he cut taxes to help business and spur economic growth.
I think John Kennedy was a pragmatist. He wasn't an ideologue. He resisted that effort to pin him on the spectrum. And I remember being attracted to him in part because the liberals in the party thought he was too conservative and the conservatives thought he was too liberal. Remember that.
But on the big domestic issues of the day, Kennedy moved steadily in a liberal direction. He introduced a civil rights bill and was planning a pilot anti-poverty program. Kennedy was tough, compassionate, activist, words that could also describe the Democratic Party of that time.
In 1961, when John Kennedy came into office, I think this country was characterized, and the Democratic Party was characterized by a remarkably strong faith in what you could achieve in government. I remember thinking there was no problem that faced us that we couldn't resolve.
And then, suddenly, in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in as president. In his first speech, he said of the Kennedy legacy, "Let us continue." He not only continued Kennedy's programs, but doubled and redoubled them. He toughened the Kennedy Civil Rights Bill, expanded the pilot poverty plan to a full-fledged war on poverty, and rammed them both through Congress. These laws helped form Johnson's vision, the Great Society.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice, to which we're totally committed in our time.
The Kennedy-Johnson push for civil rights yielded an incendiary and segregationist reaction led by Alabama's Governor George Wallace. He said he would stand in the schoolhouse door to stop integration. He did, until the National Guard made him move aside, allowing the first black student to be admitted. In 1964, to make his point against integration, Wallace ran in selected presidential primaries against stand-ins for Johnson. He was the champion of what was called the white backlash. Wallace took his issue to states far from the Deep South, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Maryland. Surprisingly, he carried between 30 and 40% of the vote. Obscure primaries a quarter of a century ago, but they revealed the dim outline of an issue which would grow and change and haunt the Democratic Party. But you wouldn't have known it at the Atlantic City Convention in 1964. For his vice presidential running mate, Johnson chose Mr. Civil Rights, the ebullient Senator Hubert Humphrey. The Johnson campaign painted Republican nominee Barry Goldwater as a right-wing extremist. Goldwater made it easy.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Johnson had other ideas. The economy was booming, making it easier to help the unfortunate.
Poverty is not a trait of character. It is created by circumstances. 30 million Americans live in poverty. So will their children, unless the cycle is broken. That's the goal of President Johnson's war on poverty. Help win it. Vote for him on November 3rd.
America was at peace, all but a few soldiers in Vietnam. Johnson was a tough anti-communist, but said there was no need to send more American boys to do what Asian boys could do. Like Kennedy, Johnson and the Democratic Party came across as tough, compassionate, and activist. It was an exhilarating, upbeat campaign.
The Young Citizens for Johnson have as guest of honor Lucy Baines Johnson, youngest daughter of the president, who is on a one-woman campaign tour for her father. She may not be able to vote, but she conducts herself like an old political pro. Until she gets out on the dance floor, that is. Then the teenager takes over as Lucy does the Watusi with all the verve of an expert. Lucy says she'll never tire of the campaign trail as long as the band plays on.
The band played on. Johnson won.
The Republican elephant had gotten smashed. Johnson's margin of victory was the biggest in American history, 61% to 39%. But a strange thing happened. The American Southland used to be known as the Solid South. Solid for Democrats, that is. But look at the states that Goldwater carried. His home state of Arizona and 5 states of the Deep South. How amazing. Johnson, a Southerner, wins in a landslide and yet loses the Deep South. This small defection, triggered by resentment about civil rights, is the first of many in our Democratic story. Still, civil rights was an idea that was long overdue. For most Americans, it appealed to an innate sense of fairness, and it was just the beginning. I'm not sure I can be objective. Not long after this, in mid-1966, I became a speechwriter for President Johnson. I was proud then and now of what was accomplished. America was transformed. Not every program worked, we know that, but most Americans today wouldn't want to be without the best of LBJ's great society. Environmental controls, Medicare, health research, job training for poor teenagers, full voting rights for minorities, and many others. It was the work of Democrats, the party whose hallmark, then and now, was a belief that government could often be a solution, not just a problem.
The good times did not last. In 1965, the war in Vietnam heated up. North Vietnamese regulars came into South Vietnam. Johnson and his advisors now said that Asian boys could no longer do the job alone. American soldiers headed for Vietnam. Their numbers escalated. Some Americans felt betrayed by Johnson's changed position. An anti-war movement sprung up across the country. There was a political cost for the party, mostly Democratic protesters assailing a Democratic president. The tension ran deeper than politics. Tom Hayden was a leader of a radical group, Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS.
And it was very concrete and very personal, not just between police and demonstrators or politicians and demonstrators, but between fathers and sons, between parents and children, around dinner tables, over whether the war was right or wrong, or whether somebody's hair should be that length, or whether somebody should go to Sweden, or whether somebody should serve in Vietnam, or whether the children were behaving in the way the parents had hoped. In my own case, my father would not speak to me for 15 years.
Other tumult rocked the Democratic coalition. Racial violence. The long, hot summers had arrived in Watts, then in Chicago and Baltimore, Cleveland and Jacksonville, Newark and Detroit. In April of 1968, in Memphis, Reverend Martin Luther King was killed. Riots broke out in 168 cities. Turbulence in the slums, turbulence on campus, turbulence. The reaction moved beyond race. George Wallace bolted the Democratic Party, formed his own, and ran for president.
Why are more and more millions of Americans turning to Governor Wallace? Open a little business and see what might happen.
As president, I will stand up for your local police and firemen in protecting your safety and property.
Not only safety and property, but populist values.
Come up here after I've completed my speech and I'll autograph your sandals for you. Not anything wrong with you that a good haircut wouldn't cure. You're not a she, are you? You're a he. Oh, I'm sorry. I can't read. Sometimes I can't hardly tell the he's from the she's in your group. You've got some folks out here who know a lot of four-letter words, but there are 2 four-letter words they don't know. W-O-R-K and S-O-A-P. You don't know those 2-letter words, I'll tell you that much. You who want a passport to Hanoi, the day after I go into office, you just check with me and I'll give it to you, and you go on over there as far as I'm concerned. And you anarchists had better have your day now, because I tell you again, you're through after November 5th in this country. But I tell you what, you lie down in front of my automobile when I come out here, and you won't want to lie down in front of it anymore. That's all I'm going to say to you.
But it's not
The peace movement also found a champion. Senator Eugene McCarthy broke tradition and challenged an incumbent president.
Oh, we said we'd negotiate, that the war had to be ended, and that we, I said that this is the only way to proceed. It was to negotiate an end to it, and that I guess we said that we didn't think it was going to be a very happy ending. And, the ending was terrible, but it wouldn't have been any worse if they'd done it in '69.
The first primary was in New Hampshire. Idealistic young volunteers for McCarthy cut their long hair, shaved their beards. They were clean for Gene and flooded the state.
And so it's just crucial that you pay very close attention to the appearance you are presenting.
McCarthy, running much better than expected, almost won. Then, suddenly,
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
the protesters said he was driven out of office. Johnson said it had been planned in advance. In either event, he was out.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
The pace stepped up. John Kennedy's younger brother, Senator Robert Kennedy, jumped into the race, splitting the anti-war movement, but also expanding its base. Some said he was ruthless. Others said he understood the pain of the unfortunate.
Where men can be deprived because their skin is black, in the fullness of time, others will be deprived because their skin is white.
When Johnson dropped out, Humphrey came in. He was a liberal champion, but publicly backed Johnson on the war, thus angering many in the anti-war movement.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
On June 5th, Robert Kennedy won the last primary in California. Bob Kennedy killed, riots, Martin Luther King killed. The country seemed to be tearing itself apart. Opposing forces were converging on the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
I was planning to organize and help lead demonstrations in Chicago, which were to be anti-war.
As the convention approached, Chicago's powerful mayor, Richard Daley, took a tough stand against violence in his city.
He should have had instructions to shoot arsonists and to shoot looters. Shoot arsonists to kill and shoot looters in order that they be detained. And in my opinion also there should have been mace used on these looters when this was being conducted.
And as the violence in our society and the tension deepened, I just felt that I was heading into a whirlwind in Chicago.
Outside the convention hall, there were confrontations. An official report later said it was a police riot. The police claimed that the demonstrators were provocative, hurling objects, even human waste. George McGovern was in Chicago as a candidate, having inherited Kennedy delegates.
Did you see the demonstrations, and what did you think of them? I did. I watched them from a fourth-floor window in the Blackstone Hotel. It was a sickening thing to see. There's no question that some of the protesters got out of line, but one can't argue that the Chicago police didn't get out of line. They did. There was brutality, there was overkill on the part of the police, and that's probably where we lost the 1968 convention, the clash between those two Americas that you could see on the street. Young policemen on one hand, young protesters on the other. They were from two different worlds, and that became clear to the country, and that division went right through the Democratic Party.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Chicago Mayor Daley shouted an epithet that Daley supporters later maintained was faker. The violence raging outside the convention spread inside, and political differences turned venomous.
Colorado. Mr. Chairman, Colorado rises to a point of information. Is there any rule under which Mayor Daley can be compelled to suspend the police state terror perpetrated this minute on kids in front of the Conrad Hilton?
The '68 convention in Chicago was one of the landmarks of political conflict, you know, in modern American history, really.
Looking back on it, you say... Gene Kirkpatrick, professor of political science, today an energetic Republican, was then a Democrat.
Were you still for Humphrey at that time?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I was in Chicago with the Humphrey campaign. I mean, it was mean, and it was bitter, and it was a kind of deeply divided party.
You know, we were abused. No candidate's ever been abused the way I was or my workers were at any convention, probably in the history of democratic countries. I don't know.
How abused?
Well, they were physically beaten up with no cause on the floor, on the streets, and in the hotel, uncalled for, you know, invasions of privacy and physical beatings.
By whom?
Chicago police primarily.
Chaos. The young blue-collar policemen, probably Democrats, and the young protesters, probably Democrats. The protesters chanted, "The whole world is watching." People watching on TV saw a political party that couldn't even control its own convention. It was not an auspicious moment to begin a presidential campaign.
I proudly accept the nomination of our party.
There was a second issue. Humphrey had entered the race too late to run in most of the few primaries that existed in 1968. He won the nomination without competing in the primaries. There was a bitter argument about this.
Hubert Humphrey was picked perfectly fairly, but Hubert Humphrey was picked by a convention which consisted largely of elected officials and party regulars.
But he didn't run in primaries. He did not run in primaries.
That's right. But the rules of the Democratic Party didn't require that a nominee run in the primaries.
Stole it, purely.
Well, he stole it according to the extant rules at the time. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Well, though, I mean, you know, that's the democratic process. You follow the rules.
It was not a democratic process.
It was
a totally rigged, rubber-stamped convention designed to ignore the will of the voters in the primaries who had rejected the president, rejected Humphrey. And that's what caused the rage.
It was absolutely fair in terms of the ground rules we were then operating on. Hubert didn't violate any of the rules. He took advantage of what was then the accepted, established way of nominating a president.
In response to this argument and seeking to calm the convention, Humphrey endorsed a commission to change the nominating rules for the next election. Humphrey called for unity. He got some, but he also got the Dump the Hump movement.
I personally believe that there's not a problem that we have that we can't talk out. I don't think we can shout it out.
You know, to get elected president, you have to look like a president, among other things. And they wouldn't give him his dignity. Every place he went, he would try to speak, and they'd boo him. They'd have the bullhorns and the eggs, and worse.
We have not come to talk with you, Mr. Humphrey. We have come to arrest you. In Vietnam, there's a wound that does not cease its bleeding. All of my life, I have stood guard against those forces of reaction and bigotry and discrimination that would weaken and poison the atmosphere of this land. And now, what is the end result? The end result is that a handful of militant anarchists and nihilists who believe in nothing have determined that they're going to destroy a man, a party, and weaken a country. But ladies and gentlemen, they're not going to do it. We're going to succeed. We're going to win.
To think that pursuing a policy that let Richard Nixon get elected was our salvation, which is a lot of them had told me that. They said, well, I'd rather have Nixon. I said, you can't mean that. I guess they did.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
The election was indeed close. But in a normal two-party race, without Wallace, Nixon would have won by a bigger margin. Why? 59 million people watched the convention on television. Many associated its images with the Democratic Party. They didn't like what they saw. What they did like watching looked quite different. The most popular television show of the 60s was Bonanza. Talk about American cultural values. It glorified families, hard work, order, and morality. In the public mind, Democrats ended up on the wrong side of the screen.
Social issues. Democrats were also losing on foreign policy. Look, in 1968, there was an unpopular war and an unpopular anti-war movement. Democrats somehow ended up associated with both. Hard as it is to believe now, most Americans, albeit unhappily, tended to support the president's position on the war. Americans certainly did not buy the idea of some in the anti-war movement that America itself was a malign force in the world. And so, split down the middle, with good and decent people on both sides, a great political party foundered.
As the 1972 primaries began, the Democrats valiantly tried to put it back together again. Senator Henry Scoop Jackson was one contender. He wanted to adapt the old Kennedy-Johnson point of view to new times. He was a domestic liberal and a foreign policy hardliner. His campaign faltered early. Hubert Humphrey was back and proved to be a potent vote-getter. George Wallace returned to the Democratic Party, winning 5 primaries, broadening his themes. Then, in Laurel, Maryland, violence struck again. Wallace was crippled for life. George McGovern was the man who generated media electricity. His campaign was based on a new coalition, a coalition of cause movements. It was called the New Politics. It was a time of rethinking and ferment. Activists pushed new agendas. Each movement had a solid and decent core of values, but each tended to exaggeration. Civil rights sounded like quotas. Peace sounded like anti-defense. Environmentalism sounded like anti-growth and anti-business.
Remember, the society was in turmoil then.
Agreed.
You had civil rights, you had women's rights, you had environmental issues, you
Peace
had
issue.
Peace issue.
Right.
This society was fragmented. Now, those people decided, as people have in the past of the 150-year or 200-year history of the Democratic Party, to take their cause into the Democratic Party, which we have always invited them to do, and they just out-organized the opposition, which had gotten, if I may say so, rather fat and comfortable.
One of the ways they out-organized the opposition was by using the new rules.
The McGovern rules that came into effect for the first time in the 72 convention were aimed at widening the participation in the presidential nominating process. I saw the reforms not as something to destroy the Democratic Party, but something to save it against the kind of explosive divisions that erupted in 1968.
It's good to open up a party. The reforms yielded many more primaries, but there was a problem: rigid delegate quotas for women, young people, and minorities. The 1972 Miami Convention was a struggle between McGovern and Humphrey. Who would get the delegates from Cook County, Illinois? The McGovernites said that even though the delegation, led by Mayor Daley, had been elected, it should be unseated because, among other things, it didn't have the required number of blacks, women, and young people. They backed a challenge delegation, unelected, co-chaired by a young minister named Jesse Jackson. Daley versus Jackson.
Mr. Mayor, suppose you are disenfranchised as a delegate along.
Oh, you know they wouldn't do that to me, Jay.
Decided until
They
the
wouldn't.
final state cast its
They
vote.
did.
That state was Ohio.
Ohio cast 69 votes yes, we're good, and 70 votes no.
That does it.
Daley was bounced.
We have 59 seats, and he has none. If he's interested in getting a seat, he should ask those of us who got some seats.
George McGovern was nominated, but when he delivered his program to the voters, it was already 2:30 in the morning when most of America was sleeping.
I'm happy to join you for this benediction of our Friday sunrise service.
It was the greatest speech I ever gave in my life. I gave it the best of any speech I've ever given in my life. I've had people like Walter Cronkite tell me that, but it came at 2:30 in the morning after everybody was in bed. My mother saw it, and I think two of my oldest children, but beyond that, I'm not sure who saw it other than the die-hard delegates in the convention hall. And this was a tragedy, because here I was, a junior senator from South Dakota, largely unknown by most Americans. Here was an opportunity for me to converse directly for 35 or 40 minutes with 80 or 90 million Americans, and we blew it by a lot of horseplay on the convention floor that ran on until 2 o'clock in the morning.
Later, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill would observe that George McGovern had been nominated by the cast of Hair.
I regret the fact that my opposition to the war in Vietnam led a great many regular Democrats to think that I wasn't one of them. And I think that some of the anti-war crowd that supported me and some of the other movements, perhaps even some elements of the women's movements, the civil rights groups, the environmentalists, some of the others were perceived as, by party regulars, as not being one of them. So we got the reputation of being a kind of a counterculture, a splinter group that really wasn't at the mainstream of American life. I disagree with that interpretation, but I accept the fact that that perception on the part of a great many Americans hurt us very badly in the general election in '72.
Richard Nixon knew exactly how to take advantage of that perception. Sensing McGovern's weakness, Nixon went after a bedrock Democratic constituency, blue-collar workers.
The McGovern bill would make 47% of the people in the United States eligible for welfare. And who's going to pay for this? Well, if you're not the 1 out of 2 people on welfare, you do.
The cause groups helped McGovern get nominated, but they were a drag on his general election campaign. Gary Hart, then a young lawyer, was McGovern's campaign manager.
Those groups that supposedly nominated George McGovern often gave us the biggest fits later on. They weren't in love with George McGovern. They were using the McGovern campaign to make their own cause felt. I can remember, for example, outside the National Democratic campaign headquarters in Washington in the fall of 1972, Jesse Jackson leading picket lines because McGovern wasn't strong enough on poor people. I can remember war protesters saying McGovern wasn't strong enough against the Vietnam War. I remember gay protesters chaining themselves to the desks of the McGovern headquarters because McGovern wasn't strong enough on gay rights.
What was the fate of McGovern's passionate attempt to build a new coalition?
I said at the Gridiron Dinner, we opened the doors of the Democratic Party and 30 million Democrats walked out.
Not quite, but close. The Republicans won everything but Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Was there a way to get the pieces back together? To get the Southerners back? To get back the people disturbed about the erosion of values? To get back the voters concerned about defense? Well, suppose there was a candidate from the South, quite religious, with a military background, who deeply believed in racial harmony. A man who could appeal to moderates and liberals.
This man is a farmer. He is also an engineer, a father, a Sunday school teacher, and a former governor. This man is Jimmy Carter, an uncommon man who is now...
Here was a Democrat who could even beat up on the Washington bureaucracy.
We now have, in the federal government, the worst, most confused, bloated, overlapping, and wasteful bureaucracy that human beings have ever created.
He played off the Republican Watergate scandal.
I'll never tell a lie. I'll never make a misleading statement.
Carter unified the Democrats at the 1976 convention.
It's a pleasure to be here with all you Democrats. and to see that our bicentennial celebration and our bicentennial convention has been one of decorum and order without any fights or free-for-alls. Among Democrats, that can only happen once every 200 years.
Carter beat Gerald Ford by a narrow margin. It seemed as if he had put Humpty Dumpty together again, liberal here, conservative there. But it was not to be. It was a troubled moment. The unkindest cut of all struck at the Democratic strong point, traditional big guy, little guy economics. Those are little guys on the gas lines. There were little guys paying high interest rates and high prices. That was not acceptable to some Democratic liberals, particularly Senator Ted Kennedy, who challenged Carter for the nomination in 1980.
It's time to say, no more American hostages. No more high interest rates. No more high inflation. And no more Jimmy Carter.
Kennedy implied that Carter had betrayed liberalism and the party.
Friends, I've seen some oddities off stage as well as on, but never anything odder than Jimmy Carter in a Democratic primary, because he may be the most Republican president since Herbert Hoover, and he may give us a depression that'll make Hoover's look like prosperity.
Kennedy for president. We gotta fight back.
Of course, Carter did not take to it kindly. He said, I think some maybe inartful words, I'll kick his, I forget what it was. But that's what he did, of course. Yeah. But we all got kicked in the process. Ted and I are old friends. We've been together for almost 30 years now, or 25, and he called me, and I said, Ted, I'm very sorry about this, because we're not going to leave voluntarily, so we got to have a big fight here. And we're all going to get hurt, and all we can do is help the Republicans. And I said, Ted, we're not that bad. We're doing our best here in some miserable circumstances. Well, we had our fight, and the rest is history.
Carter beat Kennedy in the primaries, but even at the convention, the party split was visible. Losers, like Kennedy, usually hold the winner's hand in the air in a sign of unity and victory for the next morning's newspaper. Carter wanted that, desperately. Do it, Ted, do it. He didn't do it. A handshake and a pat on the back was all Carter got. So the Democrats lost ground three ways: the economy, social issues, and foreign policy. In 1980, a new era began.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Reagan won the South back from Carter and won other places too. He won big, and it got worse. In 1984, those so-called special interests became the controversial Democratic political story. One contender was especially critical.
I criticized the approach, which was candidates going around to constituency groups, which included labor, included minorities, included women, included environmentalists, included arms controllers, saying, and having to kind of take an oath to a litany of their demands. And what it did was project an image of weakness. The reason I ran for president was because I heard a lot of people around the country, Democrats, active, concerned, lifelong Democrats, saying, we have become a party of special interests. I didn't create that slogan. I was hearing it at the grassroots.
Hart tried to link the special interest groups to Walter Mondale's campaign. Because the AFL-CIO had endorsed Mondale early, organized labor bore the brunt of Hart's attack.
I felt it was an ironic and highly opportunistic exercise in hypocrisy, a tactic that gives hypocrisy a bad name, inasmuch as Gary Hart had never shrunk from labor support. I believe the trade union movement is least deserving of that label. We are not a single issue group. Of all of the elements that took part and were players in that election and in this election. We were probably virtually the only ones that made no demands.
In the meantime, and I go, as you know, back to the Humphrey days and so on, I know what these fights do to a party. We kind of say this is us, we're celebrating life, but actually it hurts terribly.
Yet another split emerged. Jesse Jackson ran for president. He was a natural politician and a brilliant campaigner. He wanted to move the party in a new direction. Some labeled it very liberal, some called it radical. Jackson himself used the term progressive.
The black voting bloc is a key to progressive politics. When blacks vote en masse, it means our progressive white allies can win also, as opposed to our conservative adversaries winning.
Jackson was brilliant and controversial. As the first black to mount a serious presidential campaign, he broadened American democracy, energizing new voters. But he praised Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, reached out to the PLO leader Yasser Arafat, accepted support from the anti-Semitic black Muslim leader Louis Farrakhan, and was for deep cuts in American defense spending. His views turned off many moderate voters. As Mondale was sewing up the nomination, he chose Geraldine Ferraro as his vice presidential running mate. She was the first woman on a national ticket. Many hailed the historic choice, but it also heated up the special interest charge. To some, Mondale appeared to be collapsing under pressure from activist feminists who had lobbied for Ferraro's selection.
There were some people who said this represented a cave-in to a special interest, right? And that hurt the party because it came at the end of a long sequence of cave-ins to special interests. 4 years have gone by. I wonder if you could reflect for us on both aspects of that.
Well, Ben, I've heard that it's caving into special interests, and when women who comprise 52% of the population are considered a special interest, I mean, I find it rather silly.
The choice was not based on merit alone.
If I were not a woman, I would not have been the candidate, because my experience is obviously a third-term member of Congress. I mean, how many third-term members of Congress are on the national ticket?
A very effective one, though.
Thank you.
No,
but it's really a fact. I mean, I would not have even been considered if I were not a woman. If I were Gerald Ferraro from New York, I would not have been considered. And I'm realistic enough and honest enough to admit that. But I think that being that they were looking for a woman, unfortunately, in this country, we just don't have enough women in the positions from which national candidates are traditionally chosen. We don't have enough women in the state houses. We don't have enough women in the United States Senate. That's where women are traditionally chosen from. We don't have enough women with experience.
The Democrats had still other problems.
Mr. Reagan will raise taxes, and so will I. He won't tell you. I just did.
In the public mind, Mondale had confirmed the Republican charge that Democrats were the party of more taxes and more spending. The only thing the Republicans wanted more of was Reagan Democrats, and one was on the podium of their own convention in Dallas, stressing that the Democrats had lost touch with their own past glories.
A recent article in the New York Times noted that the foreign policy line that emerged from the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco is a distinct shift from the policies of such Democratic presidents as Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson. I agree. When the Soviet Union walked out of arms control negotiations and refused even to discuss the issues, the San Francisco Democrats didn't blame Soviet intransigence, they blamed the United States. But then they always blame America first.
Reagan won a landslide. Democrats held their own in congressional, state, and local elections. But at the presidential level, where party images are formed, they were in big trouble. New party chairman Paul Kirk was one of many Democrats who saw the need for change and the need to recapture older Democratic traditions.
having lost 4 out of the last 5 elections, and I use this phrase, when you're brought to your knees that many times, you ought to be brought to your senses as well. When you listen to Ronald Reagan in 1984, never mention a Republican, but talk about the greatest days of this republic and helping people remember, what names did he call? Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, Scoop Jackson, everyone national Democrats.
The Democratic National Committee acted.
Well, the first things we did was did away with the proliferation of the caucuses. We had a caucus for every cause and every group, instead of having a national message to a national audience.
Other Democrats also reasserted a mainstream view.
We put together a group that we called the Democratic Leadership Council. It consisted of elected officials at the federal level, members of the Senate, members of the House, governors, mayors, other state and local elected officials around the country who were willing to accept some responsibility for the message that represented the Democratic Party.
In 1986, there was more good news. The Democrats recaptured control of the Senate. 4 new seats came from the South. The new Southern senators were moderates who had appealed to blacks and middle-of-the-road whites. Southern politics had changed. Jesse Jackson registered black voters. George Wallace had been elected governor of Alabama with heavy black support. And Southern Democratic politicians tried to move the party in a more moderate direction. They agreed to hold all their 1988 primaries early and on the same day, Super Tuesday.
But politics is not a tale of simple straight lines. The 1988 presidential race went forward with a field of 7 candidates. The winnowing process soon left only 2. One was Reverend Jackson. He ran well on Super Tuesday. His issue range was wider, and his positions were much moderated from 1984. Yet he continued to maintain that the Democrats should move ever more leftward. He ran a startling race with some stunning successes, playing the media like a fiddle, still bringing in new voters, still antagonizing others. Jackson remains a Democratic heavyweight. It was not Jackson, but Governor Michael Dukakis who won a solid string of later primaries and the nomination. Dukakis, looking toward the general election, moved his campaign toward the center. His choice of a vice presidential running mate, moderate conservative Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas, cheered the party's mainstream.
The Massachusetts and the Texas axis was good for the country and good for the Democratic Party in 1960, and it's going to be a real winner in November of '88.
Because it's time to raise our sights, to look beyond the cramped ideals and the limited ambitions of the past 8 years, to recapture the spirit of energy and of confidence and of idealism that John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson inspired a generation ago.
After the convention, Democrats were optimistic. The Republicans went after Dukakis. The name of the game in New Orleans was trash to do. Republicans took aim at the idea that the Democrats had really moderated their views. Republicans said it was a trick. Democrats, they said, were afraid to use the dreaded L word, but they were just as liberal as ever and maybe more so. They said Dukakis was soft on defense, that he was weak on traditional values, that he was an anti-business inflationary tax and spender, a formal assault on classic American political values. The attacks continued throughout the campaign.
So what have we? In the first part of the 1960s, a compassionate, tough, activist party, a great party. And then in the late 1960s and through to the early 1980s, meaning well, trying hard, splitting this way and that, the Democrats were perceived to have strayed from the mainstream. Today, they are trying to come back and are under fire. We've heard from many of the important players, but not yet from the man who counts the most.
Speaking of the convention, you know, I was in Atlanta. I picked up this very interesting button. It's got your picture on it and President John Kennedy's picture on it. How do you like that one? Which says, it shows Governor Dukakis and John Kennedy, and it says, the tradition lives on.
Right.
How do you like that?
I like it.
What about the philosophy of the Kennedy-Johnson time compared to now? Is it the same?
Well, I think Jack Kennedy was very much a gut issue Democrat, although there was a dimension to him that went far beyond that, particularly in international affairs. But he was a guy who believed, as I do, that those mainstream issues are basic and fundamental. Jobs, housing, college opportunity, education, health care. Those were the things he talked about over and over again. He talked about the American dream. He talked about expanding the circle of opportunity to all of our citizens. But he also had an additional dimension, which I hope and I believe I have. He understood the forces of change that were sweeping the world at the time. And he brought that special understanding of what was happening out there and why it was important for the United States to be strong and to remain strong. His view of Latin America, for example, I think was typical of that. He was tough. He wouldn't countenance the introduction of Soviet offensive weapons into the hemisphere, but he also understood that building a new relationship with our democratic neighbors and allies in Central and Latin America was very important. And he used to say over and over and over again, if we're going to be strong militarily, we have to be strong economically as well. The two go hand in hand. That was an important part of Jack Kennedy.
Your opponents say you're soft on defense, yet you go around quoting John F. Kennedy's very famous line, "We'll pay any price, bear any burden to assure the success of liberty." Is that our mission in the world, to extend and defend liberty? Is that your philosophy of...
Sure. Now, how you do it, and when you use military force, when you use our military power, and when you use other means, obviously, is a judgment that has to be made. It was John Kennedy who, in effect, negotiated our withdrawal from Laos. And some think that had he been reelected, we would not have plunged into the war in Vietnam. In fact, I think that probably would not have happened. But there are many, many ways for the United States to be the nation in this world that inspires other nations to freedom and human rights and democracy, and creates an environment in which those kinds of values are important and are extended to people all over the world. Sometimes that may require military force. Other times it will require example. Other times it will require economic assistance. Other times it will require the kind of new relationship with the nations of Latin America, or for that matter, other parts of the world that John Kennedy created and was involved in, that I hope I can be involved in.
Governor, every Democrat we interviewed for this show agrees that the early to mid-1960s were a golden Democratic era. The party was activist, tough, compassionate, and very popular, and suddenly the party shattered and it was very unpopular. Do you agree with that view?
I think two things happened. First, we were torn apart by the war. We were a party that first national convention I went to as an alternate delegate was in 1968 in Chicago, and it was one of the most difficult, one of the most depressing, one of the most searing, if that's the word, kinds of experiences I've ever had. I remember coming out of the convention 3 days later and feeling very, very badly about our party, about what had happened. So I don't think you can minimize that. I think the second thing that happened was that we somehow almost subconsciously began to conclude that the way you win elections is try to please every constituency around. And you can't do that.
Was that tightness of the cause movement to the Democratic Party, was that translated by the public as being too liberal?
I don't know that it translated as too liberal. I think what it said to a lot of average Americans is they're kind of forgetting me. I'm out here and I have hopes and dreams and aspirations for myself, for my kids, for my community. I may or may not be part of an organized movement, but I want my political leaders and I want the Democratic Party to speak for me.
Governor, at the convention in Atlanta, you said that this campaign should not be about ideology, but about competence. Yet as we sit here, you are, it seems to me, expressing a philosophy.
Yes, I want our party to be tough, and I want our country to be tough, but I want us to be progressive. We didn't become the greatest nation in the world because we were satisfied with the status quo. We've always been a nation that's been moving ahead, always restless, always insisting that we do better, that we expand opportunity for all of our people. We're never satisfied to sit on the status quo, and that was something that John Kennedy expressed as eloquently as anybody I can remember, and it's something that I'm going to be expressing and have been and will be in the course of this campaign, and I hope as President of the United States. But The United States can never stand still. We've got to move forward, and we've got to move forward in a way which makes this a better nation and makes this a better world, and that's a very fundamental difference between me and Mr. Bush.
Has the party come back to the mainstream? Governor Dukakis says yes. The Republicans say no. I think the election will turn on the way the voters answer that question. Despite all the problems that have plagued the Democratic Party, it is still seen as the party of the little guy, the party that can make government work in the people's interest if it doesn't go too far out, too far astray, too fast. I think a majority of Americans want to vote Democratic if they can. In a not-so-distant past, the Democratic Party was the great engine of progress in America. It was a party of international responsibility, of economic vigor, of solid social traditions. Times change, but values can and should endure. If Democrats can be credible about that idea, they will be competitive this year and for years to come. Thank you for watching. I'm Ben Wattenberg.